Good morning. This is Bill from Curious Cars on well, you know what? The morning's okay. I can't complain. It's actually only in the high 60s this morning, but I'll get into the weather in a minute. What I have today is a 1995 Chevrolet Corvette Indy Pace Car Replica. And by replica, I don't mean it's a user-end fake done to a regular 1995 Corvette, but rather a factory replica of the 2 or 3 cars that actually paced the Indy race in 1995. But we'll get into that as we go. First, a quick update. As I said, the weather is mixed, you know, like it's nice in the mornings, it's nice in the evenings, and that's all great. But the middle of the day is still hot, shitty, and tropical. And, you know, honestly, I could just use a cold snap of some kind. I really could. You walk outside at 2 in the afternoon, and it's hot. It's just miserably hot. The tropical sun is baking down. I get in my truck, it's hot inside, everything inside is hot. The temperature shows 95 until I start driving. Look at the fire ants here. Yeah, Peter really needs to get on this shit. I'm going to step in that and get skeletonized in like 2 seconds, but I'll keep an eye out for that. But anyway, it just sucks. We really do need a cold snap. And again, it's just a reminder to me of what the hell I'm doing living here at all. Because this is the weather people actually come down here for, and here I am being miserable. But that said, it is what it is. I'm still taking the coronavirus whiskey. I took more this morning. As I mentioned before, the coronavirus appears to be fading, particularly after these last midterm elections with the week-long vote count. I take it now just for medicinal purposes, in case there's a coronavirus lurking somewhere, and also to protect against any run-of-the-mill illnesses like, the traditional flu, a common cold, or rickets, or whatever. So, a little whiskey just can't hurt at all, and that's where we're at. My lady friend, there's some news there. She has a horse. She's had a horse for many, many years. It's her thing. I'm allergic to horses, so it's just not my thing. Not to mention, I find them to be giant, terrifying animals. But anyway, she's retiring her horse. It's getting sent off to somewhere, I think the glue factory, but she claims some retirement home in Ocala. And she's, happy to do it. It's time. But at the same time, she doesn't know what to do with herself. And she's talking about buying a chicken. I mean, first of all, we have 2 wiener dogs that are going to turn the chicken into a bloody pile of feathers in like 7 seconds, I suspect, if a chicken is brought into the house. Number 2, what the hell are we going to do with the chicken? What am I going to do with the chicken running around the house? I mean, we really don't have the sort of house that's set up for a chicken. It's more of a Peter thing. If the goats are gone, I could see him having chickens around, but we don't. It's just not set up for that, and I have no idea what the hell she's thinking, and I hope to God it doesn't happen, but we'll see. More importantly, at least in my little world, is the premier Gulf Coast Classic Auction is happening on December 2nd and 3rd in Punta, Gorda. And after I, left Auto House, sort of, I'm still sort of consulting there, but for the most part, I've gone out and, I'm doing other things. And I'm running a shitload of cars through that auction. Stuff that I've been collecting for a while needs to go. It's all being run. I'm not going to take anything home. So, whatever it goes to, it goes to. And I've just been getting cars ready nonstop. Just endless shit. Like that Cosworth Vega video that's coming up. Well, I'm not going to drive it without a new timing belt. I don't know how old that thing is, and I could just see it imploding. So it also needs motor mounts, a tranny mount, a transmission mount, and a few other bits and pieces. All the cars need detailed. I have a Corvette that needs a power steering rack, so I've hired the transsexual mechanic for that. I've also hired Dalton, the detailer, to do all the cars, which is just frankly excruciating. Having him give me that smirk as he takes my money for walking around the thing and barely putting a rag on it, but whatever. You do what you got to do. So it's endless shit. It's just endless shit, and it's all adding up. But hopefully, after that weekend, I can take a month off, drink a lot more coronavirus whiskey, hop in the motorhome if I can repair it, and head off somewhere. So that is the plan. But anyway, I'm not going to ramble on and on, make this into a giant video when it doesn't need to be. We're going to get right back into this pace car thing. And the number one thing I want you to do is go out there and hit the pace car. Just hit the pace car. You know, you hit every other damn car on the track, and I want you to be perfect. Sorry, that's a Days of Thunder reference, but it reminds me, it reminds me of a Homestead trip. You know, little Gabe the Mormon boy, I haven't talked about him in a long time. Back in the day, this is years ago, he used to go with us to some of these track events. He had some kind of a Miata or a BMW or something, and we would spend the weekend there. I remember we took him to a strip club, which was hilarious, absolutely hilarious time. But Gabe lived in terror of Chris, my friend Chris, the audio guy, because Chris is a giant, terrifying mammal. I mean, he is, number one, the worst human being on earth, as I've pointed out many times, and number two, he's just a terrible, terrible person. And Gabe was always afraid that he was going to get molested or raped by Chris. I mean, this was just, you have to understand the dynamic of the group. I mean, we're staying in a hotel. Gabe is, in there. Chris has always said that Gabe looked a little bit like one of his sisters in a wig, and, Gabe had some hot sisters. So Chris just Gabe lived in absolute terror of that. And I remember we came home drunk one night, walked in the door, and Gabe basically ran to hide in the closet. He was so scared. He thought that Chris was going to demonstrate drafting on his inner thigh, like Tom Cruise did with Nicole Kidman in Days of Thunder. But it didn't work out that way. Gabe ended up fine. He got more molested by the strip club girls than anyone, and the world just moved on. But that's an aside. Anyway, look, I've done a few C4 Corvettes, so this is not what this is going to be about. I don't need to do a review of this particular car. In fact, I'll link below to at least one, if not two, of the C4 Corvettes that I've already done in depth. And what we're going to do instead is this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about pace cars and what they are, why they are, and their significance to, not just racing, but the automotive world at large. And for the sake of time, we're going to zero in on the United States, and particularly Indy, the Indianapolis 500. Oh, because I've been boycotting F1. I mean, F1 has a big safety car stuff, but I've been boycotting it ever since they made the cars sound like V6 Buicks instead of a Banshee being electrocuted. It was a tragic loss for me, like losing an old friend. I used to religiously, even the days before, TiVo or streaming or all that shit, I used to wake up early to watch the live race. It was a big deal, and it was such a shame for me to lose that. But I think Formula One lost its way when the cars stopped turning 13,000 RPM, and it's just not for me anymore. But anyway, the two most famous series in America are probably NASCAR, not even probably, it's for sure, NASCAR and Indy. And they have produced a significant number of famous pace cars. Some more famous and a couple more infamous than others. But the basic concept is this. Look, a pace car, both in NASCAR and IndyCar, has two functions. The true pace, the one that's out there on the racetrack with the race cars. It leads the field through several warm-up laps to get them going prior to the start of the race. Pulls off the track at the beginning so the cars can hit the green flag. And then it also heads to the front of the field during caution periods, like when there's a wreck or debris on the track or some other shit that's a danger. Out comes the pace car, and all of the cars line up behind it. And then there's varying rules and such about how you can pass it or if you come out in front of it, and so on and so forth. But that is their pure point. Cars are not generally allowed to pass the pace car during caution periods. And the cars are usually based on higher performance models. Not always, in fact, quite a few haven't been. But most of them in the modern era are, and they've been enhanced for safety. performance, to deal with the rigors of keeping up with cars that are extremely fast even when they're going slow. And what I mean by that is this. I mean, so look, it's less true on a circle or oval track when, David Hasselhoff could pace the Indy race. But you get into a road course and race cars appear to be barely moving. You've got Indy cars, look, they're pacing slow. But the truth is they're pacing pretty fast because those cars, those big high horsepower open wheel cars, have to circle the track at a pretty fast speed in order to be safe, in order to keep their brakes hot, in order to keep their tires hot. And even if they're going as slow as they can within the realm of safety, the pace car, which is a normal car, almost a consumer level car, is driving its ass off just to keep up a pace that those cars can do. So, the next time you see an Indianapolis or IndyCar road race, watch the pace car during the caution lap. The other cars are barely moving, the race cars. The pace car is driving like you can see the guy is just sweating, jumping curbs and, making everything happen in order to keep the car going fast. It's particularly true in Formula One as well. But anyway, that's where it's at. So the normal speed, for a normal car is much, much different than it is for a race car. And that's why pace cars, at least in this day and age, are almost always driven by people with extensive racing experience. You need that to be able to keep up with those cars. So keeping a race safe and orderly is why a pace car has been used at every Indy 500 since its inception in 1911. There's just always been pace cars, and that's part of what keeps the race as safe as it can. Back in those days with the leather helmets and the mechanics hanging off the back and shit, everyone was always dying anyway, but the pace car helped safety that up a little bit. But this is just the actual nuts of what a pace car does, the nuts and bolts. I mean, if that was it, if that was the whole purpose and the only purpose, then any old fast car would do. I mean, a car the guy drove to the track could pace the race and nobody would care. But the other part of it, maybe the bigger part of it, at least again in this modern era, is money and marketing. Pace cars at these big events are always current production cars. They're emblazoned with the make and model, usually, of the car because, people want, the manufacturers want visibility. They pay to have their cars sponsor the race, and a bunch of them, they all want it, and then the Indy committee chooses which one is going to get it. I think Chevy and Corvette have paced it more than any other, in fact by far. But basically every manufacturer, most of them gone, some of them current, have paced the race. Your Oldsmobiles, Pontiacs, even Plymouth did it once. So it is a thing. And what it boils down to is that whole win on Sunday, sell on Monday. The manufacturers want their cars to be at the center of excitement. They want them to be seen by hundreds of thousands of people at the track and millions more on television. And they think that that's going to translate into sales at the showrooms. And probably for the most part, they're right. So it makes pace cars kind of a lucrative enterprise. On top of the handful of pace cars that actually do pace the race, there are many more parade cars, event cars, festival cars they're called, that the manufacturer has to supply to the upper echelon people at the event, the Indy executives or celebrities or what have you. There's a whole variety of cars used for a variety of events, and that's where the replica part of this car comes into play, so that millions of people will see it on TV. For instance, in '95, Chevrolet they didn't make very many of these compared to other pace cars in this era. Only 527 of these particular Corvette convertibles were made. A certain number were used to officiate the race from, the Indy executives got them as drivers, or, they had parade laps with celebrities going around the track, and they used them for that. But again, only 3 of them were modified to actually pace the race. The rest of them are really all about marketing. And they're visible all over the streets of Indianapolis before and during race weekend. And then afterward, they're buttoned up and sent to dealers while others that were made or ordered would never see any Indianapolis duty. So, a select few were there at the race and did their part to make it happen. Others were just ordered and built and sent to dealers. The significance of the 527 of these cars built was that it was just enough to supply the top Corvette dealers in the country with one each. So, after the race, every Corvette dealer got one of these things, whether it was used in the race or not, and they were able to sell it for a big markup, make some money, and have a little bit of fun with it. So, NASCAR also uses the Pace Car, just like Indy does, and, the manufacturers milk that as well for all they can, trying to drum up excitement for their cars. So anyway, look, here it is. Look, I'll give you a quick list. Some of the more interesting pace cars in Indianapolis history, because frankly, that's the most visible of them and the most obvious. There's one from NASCAR we'll get into, but pretty much all of these are going to be from Indy. We'll start with the 1920 Indianapolis 500. It used a Marmon 34. They actually called it the Pacemaker. Most pace cars back then were called pacemakers, but it was a 34. They had won the inaugural Indy 500 in 1911. And they served as the pace car for the first time in 1920 with a guy named Barney Oldfield driving, who was kind of a famous, in the dawn of the automotive age, he was one of the more famous drivers. He was the first guy to do a 100-mile-per-hour lap of the circuit. And he loved his Marmon so much after pacing it that he bought it and drove it around. And apparently the public liked it too. It had special bodywork and lines. So Marmon capitalized on that. They created a series of them called the Marmon Wasp Speedster. It had yellow paint, black trim, red wheel centers, and a 100-mile-an-hour speedometer, which arguably makes it the first ever Indy pace car replica. And there it is. So it was the start. The 26 Indianapolis 500, 1926, there was a Chrysler Imperial E80. And, what made that interesting is it's one of the first cars or first manufacturers to pace the race that actually still exists today. Most of them are, like Marmon or, whatever, just gone by the wayside. But Chrysler was only 2 years old at the time, and they created this Imperial to compete with Cadillac. It was a big deal for them. They got it to pace the race. What was more interesting about that is it was driven by a guy named Louis Chevrolet. And he was a guy who, of course, started and lent his name to the famous car company, but he was driven out of GM, drummed out by William Durant, the famous bastard William Durant. Also drummed out and driven out of GM was Walter Chrysler, who, of course, was now making this Imperial. So you have Chevrolet and Chrysler driving around in this thing, and they must have had a great chat about what a bunch of bastards were over at GM. So, yeah, it's kind of an interesting setup. What else? So we've got Lincolns. You had a couple of Lincolns in 1932 and 1946. The 32 Lincoln was a V12 thundering around the track. That's kind of a cool piece. That was driven by Edsel Ford. And then in 1946, you had another Lincoln running around, and that was driven by Henry Ford II. So a couple of Fords there driving the pace cars at Indy. Another guy, Benson Ford, would drive the Mustang a few years later. So Fords have had a lot of fun at the Indy race. Worth mentioning is the Bel Air convertible in 1955. Chevy was on top of the world with that design. It would go on to become a classic and is one of the more, notable pace cars in Indy history. In 58, Pontiac had never paced a race before. They were considered very dowdy, and we've talked about this before. A guy named Bunky Knudsen came in to revitalize Pontiac and, get them to be a performance division from being your grandmother's division. And it worked well enough. The new Bonneville in 1957 was the first Pontiac to ever pace at Indy, and was, of course, a pretty interesting car. As I just mentioned, in 64, it was the Mustang. It was a big part of that advertising blitz, one of the most modern style advertising setups that, came into existence, pushing the Mustang. Benson Ford driving one around Indy in '64. And that was one of the first times that they built a shitload of those things. I think there were like 500 cars made. Obviously not all of them used at the track. So in theory, that's kind of the first modern use of the pace car as a marketing tool. In '67, the Chevy Camaro, which was new, of course, a Mustang competitor, that paced the race. And again in 1969, with that famous orange and white car, which is really, I won't say just one of the cars of my youth, but one of the more visible and recognizable pace cars to people who aren't even really car people. That orange and white '69 Camaro pace car is just a very famous car. In '73, a Cadillac Eldorado paced it. I mean, the last thing you'd think, this big, giant convertible. Cadillac engineers had tuned it to have 500 horsepower, so it actually kept up just fine. But it was a very ill-fated race with crashes involving death and rain, and also it ended up days later it was canceled, delayed, paused, canceled. So Cadillac got to pace it, but it was a pretty shitty race. 10 years later, in '83, Buick paced the race in a tan and cream Riviera convertible with wire wheels. I mean, it looked more like something Jack Nicklaus would have driven to the golf course. And, there it is lining up in front of the Indy cars. So you had your share of Luxo barges painting these things, or pacing these things as well. In '79, you had Jackie Stewart driving a '79 Fox body Mustang. Of course, that was a significant car. Two of the more notable ones in my little world are the '78 Corvette Pace Car and the '80 Turbo Trans Am, which I think are two of the better looking liveries ever used on pace car. I mean, those things look great. And the public agreed, at least with the Corvette. Chevy put no limits on dealers ordering the pace car package in '78, and they ended up selling 6,500 of them. More than 10 times the amount of this car. I mean, you go to any collector car auction, you're probably going to see a '78 Corvette Pace Car. It's just one of those things that absolutely popped, and it looked beautiful with the silver and black livery with the, writing on the door. Just a terrific looking car. You see those all over the place. In '84, there was a Pontiac Fiero that paced the race. That was kind of an interesting piece. You had a Chrysler LeBaron in 1987, a Chevy Beretta in 1990, and Dodge Viper in 1991, and I would say that had no trouble keeping up. In '89, I believe it was, the Turbo Trans Am paced the race, and they advertised it as the first car that needed no mechanical modifications to run at Indy, although, in truth, other cars had run without mechanical modifications. They just hadn't done it very well. In fact, the '80 Trans Am was a turbo 301 engine with 200 horsepower. The 1930 Indy cars had more horsepower, and they didn't modify the engine to run the race. And it really didn't do a great job of it until, they got more horsepower a few years later. One of the weirdest ones, weirder even than the Oldsmobile Aurora that paced the race in '98, which I think is strange, was the Oldsmobile Bravada SUV in 2001 that paced there. And not just is that a weird car to have done it, or weird truck, whatever you want to call it, but it was driven by John Cougar Mellencamp's supermodel wife. Around the racetrack. So there you go. You've got bitchy, blonde, wine-drinking women driving SUVs around Indy. And frankly, that was probably the beginning of the end for that series, at least in my opinion. But that's that. Let me bring up the two more infamous pace cars in Indy history. Well, one's NASCAR, but anyway, the two more infamous pace cars in racing history. The first is in 1971 with a Dodge Challenger convertible. Al Unser won that race on his birthday. He was the only guy to have done so. at that point, and probably still today. But it was the Challenger that ended up making the headlines. It was driven by a local car dealer in Indianapolis called Eldon Palmer. And in the car were Speedway owner Tony Holman, astronaut John Glenn, and a TV reporter named Chris Schenkel or something as passengers. And there was this effort to dramatize the start of the race where the pace car would be absolutely flying at almost the same pace as the cars when they crossed the start-finish line. And the Challenger came flying into the pits at about 125 miles an hour, overheated the brakes, fucked the whole thing up, ended up sliding into a photographer's stand, you know, one of these things that has stilts and the photographers are up top. Well, the Challenger goes underneath it, knocks the whole thing over, and like 20 people are injured, some of them pretty seriously. And the race just went on as though nothing happened, but you could see this big calamity happening, you know, at the entrance to the pits. And Palmer ended up keeping the car. He was the dealer. You know, back then the Indy dealers basically got the pace cars before they were spread out around. He took the car and hid it away for a couple decades before restoring it and selling it to a collector when it wasn't such a sore spot. But my favorite pace car story, without a doubt, is from a NASCAR event. A guy named Darren Crowder. He was stuck on his motorcycle in traffic at Talladega in Alabama. And he decided to see what was going on. And it was, of course, the Talladega 500. It was a big event. He had no interest in it, or at least he wasn't going there. But all of a sudden, he can't get where he's going. It's easy for him to pull on the track, so he does. He has no ticket, and he's shirtless, which, you know, being shirtless definitely must be a detriment at a NASCAR event in Alabama. I can't imagine that's normal. And but somehow he managed to make his way without a ticket all the way to the infield and is watching the race from a tremendously good perspective, like, you know, 100 yards away from the cars as they're lining up. So the pace car comes out, parks in front of the field. They're getting ready to do that gentleman start your engine shit. And the driver gets out of the pace car and walks off. So this Crowder guy leaps over two fences, runs to this Pontiac Trans Am. I think it was a GTA in '86, but I'm not sure. I don't remember. But anyway, modern Trans Am, hops in it, peels out, almost hits some people in the pit lane, gets out on the track, and does a couple of hot laps over 100 miles an hour before people realize what's going on. The police come out, they do kind of a roadblock, they cut him off, they yank him out of the car. He ends up attacking people with his boot. Ends up getting taken into custody. They end up sending him to some sort of a psychiatric hospital for evaluation, and all of it was televised, which made it just an absolutely fascinating side note in Indy history. So that's probably one of my more favorite pace car stories. Anyways, there it is. Look, that's a brief history of some of the pace cars and an explanation of what they're all about and why. And of course, a lot of people already know that. But for some of you out there, now you understand what these things are. When you see one of these gaudy, strange-looking cars driving around with writing all over it, you know what it's for. It's for pacing the race. It's for marketing. It's for money. And it's just, you know, one thing I really like about it is it's history. I mean, there you've got this C4 Corvette. It's dated on the side, the 79th Indianapolis 500, 1995. It turns a car into history in a very visible way that, you know, anybody just walking by understands. So I think that's pretty cool. So look, I'm going to pause it there for a minute, get my shit together, have another shot of the whiskey. We'll do a quick walk around to this car just for fun, go for a drive, and call it there. So bear with me. All right, so let's take a quick look at this one. So this is a C4 Corvette, fourth generation, made from 1984 through what the hell was it? 1996, I believe, maybe 97. My brain eludes me, but I think 96. So the Corvette was really nearing the end of its rope at this point. I mean, this generation Corvette. So it was a bit of an honor for it to pace Indy when it's kind of that long in the tooth. But these are cars that I think are now starting to come into their own. They were something of the red-headed stepchildren of the Corvette collector world for a long time. But now they're starting to get recognition particularly the later years, as being pretty damn good cars. And I have to agree. I mean, I don't think people of a certain age remember how important this Corvette was when it came out in 1984, how technologically advanced and how different it was for many of the other cars around it. I mean, this was the first modern era Corvette to take it to the Europeans in a way that actually counted, in a way that made sense. Obviously they did back in the 50s and 60s, but all through the 70s and the Malaise era, the cars just became something different. Well, the 84 was much more about performance, much more about keeping up with the fancy shit like the 928s and 944s and even the Ferraris and that sort of thing coming out of Europe, and it did a pretty damn good job of it. So I am a fan of the C4 Corvette, and I will continue to be. I also think it's a good looking car. I mean, it maintains the Corvette style of real sexual kind of muscular bodywork with swooping fenders, an elongated, very low front end, a stubby tail, pop-up headlights, particularly these with their 180 degree flip, are particularly sexy to me, and a thing that I miss in cars now. You just don't see them anymore. Obviously it has tremendously gaudy paintwork, but that is a thing. Chevy, I think, decided to let their freak flag fly on these pace cars in the 90s. They were a little more subdued before. Sometimes pace cars were nothing more than just lettering down the door, but Chevy went nuts with this. They have white on the bottom, purple on top, these Chevy logos flying out flags and streamers and trailers behind it. You see the writing on the door. You've got the Indy logo with the date and time of the race. All of these 527 cars were identical in terms of equipment. They had chrome ZR1 wheels, which look great. The purple bodywork. I think this guy added these white mud flaps, which I would probably remove, but I'm leaving them on there for the hell of it, just because they obviously are keeping the sides of the car from getting marked up. And this is, by the way, one of the cars I'm selling at that premier auction. It's a nice piece, 24,000 miles, air-conditioned storage. Somebody could do a lot worse than this one. And if I had room for it, it's one I'd consider hanging on to. You see it has the 4 square taillights. That was made popular by the ZR1 model that had come out a couple of years before, actually in 1990. And then all Corvettes got the same rear end treatment, sort of a widened rear. I love the giant gas door on it. That harkens back to Corvettes of the past. The center brake light is kind of a muted affair in the middle of the taillights with a Corvette logo beneath it. You got big rectangular twice pipes. You got the Indianapolis Motor Speedway logo on the rear quarter panel. They all had white tops, which is kind of cool. You can see if you pop up that tonneau cover. I'm not going to raise the top because to hell with it, but they all had these white tops, and you've got a little area back here for, weapons or Canadians or babies. If you can stuff them behind the seats, they'll be comfortable enough there. And otherwise, there it is. So again, nice swoopy bodywork, aerodynamic mirrors, sunken door handles. The vents on the side had been new for 95. You see it's got big manhole covered disc brakes all around. Let's pop these headlights because I love the way that looks. Yeah, I just think that's really cool. Maybe I'm just a sucker for pop-ups, but I think that looks great. I like the power bulge, the twin humps in the hood, almost like a cow hood from the 60s. Of course, being at Indy, you had to emblazon your shit all over the car. This one says Corvette in big white letters atop of the windshield, so when you're driving around, people would know. The guy who owned this thing was active in Corvette clubs and associations, as a lot of these Corvette goofballs are, with their socks and their watches and their wristbands that have the Corvette logo. Here you see Corvettes of Naples on that side. Go over here, we've got the National Corvette Museum, the Corvette Owners Association member, the National Council of Corvette Clubs. Geez, this guy gets more spam than anyone I know. On the inside, they had these special black and purple seats with the 79th Indianapolis stitched into the headrest, something that makes it kind of special. And yeah, I don't know, it's just all very kind of cool. Let's have a look under the hood. This one had the LT1, one of the final incarnations of it, a little over I think 305 horsepower, maybe 300, but a great motor. That was a big change when it came out. Later in, either 96, 97, 90, whatever it was, maybe even this year, in the stick cars and in the Grand Sports, they had that LT3 engine, the sort of updated, I want to say it was 360 horse or something like that anyway. An LT1 with a lot more pep, still a pushrod engine, and maybe the ultimate incarnation of it. You can see under here everything looking nice. This is the kind of racy shit that I love on the C4. This was not a thing you saw before. When you lift up this big clamshell hood, first of all, I like seeing the lights, the way they're aimed at you. I love seeing these aluminum control arms and all the suspension work, the big brakes. I mean, it looks very, very race, very, very cool. Giant rubber, you can see there on the front, even bigger on the back. And just fantastic. This one has an automatic transmission. Don't remember how many were sticks. I'm sure you could get a few. But as always, most of these Corvettes are automatics because that's what people want. Chevy came under a lot of fire for not making the new Corvette, the C8, with a manual gearbox. And they got very offended by, man, piss off. Like, if you guys want manual gearboxes, then buy them. It costs a fortune to develop and put one in. And then like 8% of Corvette buyers opt for one. So I see their point, and I get why they didn't do it, but it's still a shame. Anyway, there it is under the hood. Very nice stuff. And, battery in sort of a weird, annoying location here. I find it very difficult to charge. But yeah, I'm sure it makes sense for weight distribution. Let me get my shit inside. I tell you what, now we'll hop inside and look at the... Oh, God, this is going to be hard one-handed. Bear with me. There we go. I'm going to drop that big hood down. Have a look inside. So there you see those purple and black leather seats special to these Indy cars. Very, very cool stuff. This guy, I believe, added this big chrome Corvette, scratch guard over the and you see on the C4s, that was one of the big complaints about these cars, was for rigidity, how high they made these thresholds. So when you're a 60-year-old guy going through a midlife crisis, you have to be Mary Lou Retton to get in this car elegantly, which I'm not. And I just have to fall in the thing and get out of it. And whatever impact I've made driving this car is lost the minute they see this sort of sad old bald fat guy try to emerge from it. The fit and finish on Corvettes had gotten a lot better by this year. I won't say the materials are super high quality, but at least they don't break apart and fall apart in your hands, which they did in the earlier models, and that's something to be said. Let's hop in. The cluster, they had gone from that sort of F16 digital setup, which I loved, to this sort of what I find to be irritating and annoying analog setup that I just don't like at all, but people seem to want it. You've got the tach over there on the left, you've got your driver information shit and the speedometer in the center, you got full gauges on the right, your volts, your temp, your oil pressure. It's a tilt wheel. You got the world's most complicated multi-function, it's got your signals, it's got your high beams, it's got your cruise control and your wipers all on one stalk. Over here you've got your headlights and your fog lights, you got your traction control, you've got a driver information center with all the warning lights here, the trip monitor which shows up on that. Start it up, see that? This one still has the stock mufflers, which is, rare. A lot of guys put on really loud pipes on these things to wake them up, which, yeah, I can agree with, but yeah, whatever. I'm glad this one's stock. The control display in this thing is a little bit dim. It's another thing I need to replace before the auction. But there you see, just 24,000 miles. You got your speedometer, your range. You can go through all the different, fuel info, English metric gauges, blah, blah, blah. You got a nice little climate control here. Digital, works great. Cold AC. Delco Bose, which of course was a big Corvette C4 thing from the beginning. You got cassette, CD, and see what we got on the radio.
95.3, The Beach.
I think Fleetwood Mac, maybe I'm wrong, is it? Whatever. You got an automatic transmission here. You've got your little Corvette LT1 badge. I think the guy might have added that. I'm not positive. Maybe that was a Pace Car thing, or even they were doing it. But that's an historical Corvette thing to have your production numbers here, or at least your power numbers there. This has the fancy seats with all the different lumbar and, other adjustments. You flip left and right to go left or right. You got an airbag over there. No glove box. You have to use this shit in the center console. I don't know what these green and red things are. They look aftermarket to me. Could be a built-in radar detector or otherwise just something, I'm not sure. You got tape storage and you got your owner's manual, so all very lovely. Before we go for a spin, I'm gonna get my shit inside and then we'll see what she's got, so bear with me one moment. Fuckers. All right, let's go for a drive. Oh, God. Nice seatbelt on here. You can hear that GM build quality when you close the door. It's like a rock crusher. Sure does run nice, though, so fires right to life. Got our 4-speed tranny transmission into play and go for a spin. I think Peter's having gate problems, which is great, so I don't have to wait for the slow gate. He just has it locked with the chain at night until he fixes it, so I'm just going to leave it open. He can figure it out himself. These are off, so everything should be good. Dalton the horn hasn't cleaned this thing up yet, so I can't blame him for the windshield, even though it looks exactly like a Dalton windshield. Yeah, and just a nice smooth drive. You got this big thick steering wheel, which feels very nice to grip. You got the defrost on. Can't believe we need that right now, but we do, I guess. Alright, there we go. And, tremendous throttle. Look, it's a Corvette, and it's a Corvette of an era where performance was back in play. So the thing's pretty quick. It's not anything by today's insane standards, but it's still, 0 to 60 in the 5-second range, quarter mile in the, 15-ish range, maybe a little beneath, and certainly enough pep to, make most guys happy who are, particularly the old guys who are driving these things to strip clubs and golf courses and the Asian massage. We're not talking about going out on a racetrack for the guy who's buying an Indy 500 replica Corvette convertible with an automatic. This is going to be more than adequate for what he needs. The handling is incredibly precise. The brakes will put you through the windshield. That's always been a hallmark of the C4, are the terrific brakes. And all in all, I think it's just a really fun car to drive. It's not a fun car to get in and out of. I will admit that in a heartbeat, but it is a fun car to drive once you're inside. So, there's a quick run to 70. That couldn't have taken that long. And it just goes down the road well. It's a great cruiser. So, if you need a little bit of pep, you got it. And the main purpose, you know, which is showing up at, you know, whatever your destination is, to get some attention, is that's no problem at all for a car that's white, purple with flags and letters and numbers all over it, and a giant Corvette script at the top of the windshield. So it certainly does its job well. So look, if you have an interest in this one, it's going to be at that Premier auction group December 2nd, 3rd. It's online. If you Google Premier Auction Group, you'll find it. Very nice guys there. They're running a bunch of my cars through, and I'll be there drinking some whiskey and having a good time, and hopefully not losing my ass. So we'll see how that goes. And otherwise, thank you very much for having a look. We appreciate it. I appreciate it. I'm going to have some more fun stuff coming up. That Cosworth Vega is almost together, and we'll get that done, and then some other stuff as well. So thanks very much. Really appreciate it. And we will see you with the next one. Take care.